So hello again. I'm going to introduce you to our next keynote speaker. It's with great pleasure that I'm introducing Carol Amderson. She has more than almost 20 years of experience in the aviation legal sector, and she's also currently Deputy General Counsel of Gulf Air, the national air carrier of the Kingdom of Bahrain. And she has a long bio. I'm not here to recall all of this, but she recently concluded her LLM thesis at the Leiden Master of Air and Space Law with a thesis which I had the honor to read, which is about human spaceflight. And today she will tell us a bit more about human spaceflight with a comparison of air and space law in the sector of commercial liability especially. I'm really honored to have her here, and I thank you to having accepted to be here, so the floor is yours.
Wow. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. It was only going to work if I went to Warsaw on Wednesday. So I decided to go to Warsaw on Wednesday so I could call in to Milan thanks to Wizz Air and their wonderfully cheap flights on the way back. I nearly had a heart attack on the roads this morning from Bergamo, but it was fine. I got here in one piece, thanks to a crazy Italian taxi driver. So, anyway, I'm here to talk to you a little bit about liability. I'm more of an air law liability person. That's how I started out my life in aviation many moons ago. Too many years ago, actually. And my interest stemmed from the fact that I could see with Virgin Galactic there needed to be some kind of commercial, some kind of comparative method for limiting liability for passengers on board these new craft. Because I'll show you in a minute, there isn't anything regulating this sector at the moment in relation to humans as opposed to damaged spacecraft. So I'll first of all give you a disclaimer. Although I am Deputy General Counsel of Gulf Air, I'm here in my own personal alumna capacity from Leiden University. These views are completely my own. Gulf Air operates aircraft, not spacecraft. So, unless we get a big injection of cash and some rockets, we're not going into suborbital space anytime soon. So, what is commercial human spaceflight? Predominantly, these are privately funded trips into suborbital space and geo-stationary space. I'm sure you guys have got the technological angles and engineering angles covered in way more detail than I do. Basically, it's the distinction between commercialized space exploration as opposed to state-sponsored projects like NASA's Shuttle. The last decade has seen many developments. Predominantly, for me, the two key elements were the fact that Dennis Tito and a bunch of others paid exorbitant amounts of money to go into space to visit the ISS because of a lifelong dream, or the fact they had nothing else to do with their millions. And also the end of the Shuttle era when NASA retired the Shuttle in 2011, that was the end of NASA's funded projects. And now they're looking for commercial entities to fill that gap. So, like I've just told you, and Dennis Tito is the first private space exploration explorer even. For him, the journey to space was the completion of a long-held dream. In the early 70s, Tito left a job at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory to pursue a career in finance, but he never stopped dreaming about going into space. He was obviously very good at finance to earn the money. Space Adventures, like a space tour company I'm sure you're all aware of, helped him to fulfill his lifetime passion, and he made history by becoming the first world's private citizen to fly to the International Space Station. It was a very sad day, I think, for most of us when NASA retired the Shuttle, but it kind of sparked this new era of commercial entrepreneurship in the sector, which I think for you guys, you're the next generation of space engineers. aerospace engineers, technological projects people. There will be no end to projects, I think, in the next 10 to 20 years. Just as I'm going into retirement, you guys will be going up there doing wonderful things. So together they mark the dawn of a new era, commercialization of space, suborbital and outer space, and a new level of reliance on privately funded commercial space activities, which is the key, one of them. Obviously, one of the main issues faced by NASA after retiring the Shuttle was how to get supplies and people, astronauts, up to the International Space Station. Many companies have bid, and then obviously Virgin Galactic does its suborbital spaceflight projects. Bigelow Aerospace is doing its space hotel project, and Boeing and Airbus have already announced this idea for point-to-point suborbital space transportation, which for me is a significant step from Virgin Galactic's model, because in effect, Virgin Galactic is a domestic space transportation method. It's a bungee jump into space. You're not crossing any geographic territorial lines. You're staying within the United States. Once you start moving from US to Tokyo in 3 hours, then it's really going to start to get problematic from a legal perspective. You probably all know about the International Space Station. The more I looked at it from a legal angle, I found it incredibly interesting. To me, it's one of the most successful, probably the most successful international project of its kind. In terms of collaboration, political views have been set aside. People just get on with it and coordinate and make it work. And just a legal fact, each component part of the ISS has the jurisdiction of the state that supplied it as a part of the project, which is funny but true. Since NASA retired the Shuttle, commercial space exploration and development companies have been retained to service the ISS. You probably all know that. That's what she looks like. Here we are, Virgin Galactic. So, on Wednesday the 4th of May 2011, the skies above the Mojave Air and Spaceport, Spaceship 2, the world's first commercial spaceship, demonstrated its unique re-entry feather configuration for the first time. I'll just give you a bit of my thesis here. Virgin Galactic's flights on Spaceship 2, to be launched by White Knight 2, basically bring commercial space transportation to an even closer reality. And okay, every year we say they're going to happen soon. I know this, but obviously with the setback in 2014, with the accident that they had, things have had to slow down a little bit. But they recently obtained their license and certification from the FAA. So it should actually be in the next 1 or 2 years, hopefully, that we see Virgin Galactic take off properly with a full payload. The objective, as stated by Virgin Galactic, is to democratize access to space for the benefit of life on Earth. Now, that's quite a big objective, I think. But it actually fits very well with the space law treaties, because they were for the common heritage of mankind, not just for one particular state, for everybody. So to increase access to space is one of the fundamental concepts of the space law treaties. And if Virgin Galactic is aiming to do this, it can only be a good thing. And it fits with the ideology that was set out in the 50s and 60s when the space treaties were actually drafted. How much you have to pay to get there is another thing. I think it's about $200,000 at the moment. Actually, if you've got 2 million Virgin Atlantic air miles, you get a free seat on Spaceship 2. You have to go around the Earth quite a bit, though, I think. And if you book a ticket on Virgin Galactic, okay, this is Obiter, you get to each time you fly to Mojave Desert on Virgin Atlantic, they upgrade you, obviously, to upper class, which is a nice perk for your $200,000 ticket. Okay. let's keep going. Yeah, we talked about Airbus concept plane. To me, the main considerations when you're looking at commercial, private human spaceflight, obviously there are legal issues, there are insurance issues. The commercial issues are put to one side, but that's about how you fund these projects. And if there is a significant loss of life or a catastrophic loss, that may put pay to things for quite a long time. I also want to talk a little bit about the socio-legal context because, as we'll see in comparison with air law, things have changed in the last 100 years. Society's evolved, unfortunately, into a compensation culture, especially in the US and the UK, and that slowly dribbles into the rest of Europe or the rest of society. And I think that's an important note to keep in mind when you're talking about liability issues for private human spaceflight, because although the authorities have made effort to hive off the liability and make it subject to special circumstances, if a multi-million-dollar businessman loses his life because of an accident with Virgin Galactic, do you think his wife is going to say, yeah, okay, we knew what the risks were? No, I don't think so. So even though the authorities, the FAA, the government, the national and the state authorities have tried their best to narrow the scope of liability, I really don't think it will work. I really don't think. But that's me being a negative, pessimistic lawyer looking at the situation. So the legal regime, what is it? As I'm sure you're aware, technology is far more advanced than the legal regime surrounding Virgin Galactic. But the legal regime for carriage of humans, basically the question that I looked at in my thesis was, should it be governed by air law or space law or some kind of new hybrid regime? So, first of all, we'll look at aviation. I think the stage that private human spaceflight is at right now is very similar to where we were in the 1920s with commercial aviation. It was the big new thing. Rich people were the only people who could afford to fly from the UK to Australia. It would take them a week or two, and they would stop many times. There would be many crashes, people would die, everything would be lost. So if you against that backdrop, if you think about Dennis Tito, it's kind of similar. Rich people playing with new toys and taking a step into the unknown almost and seeing if it works. But obviously, the governments wanted to support this new aviation industry, and the only way they could do that was to limit liability. So if people died or cargo was lost, they basically set limits to how much would be paid out to the family members if it was a person or the owner of the cargo. And that system was enshrined in the Warsaw Convention, which was drafted and implemented in 1929. And its main objective was to protect this new fledgling mode of transport by implementing hard, unbreakable, totally unbreakable liability limits for baggage, cargo, and passengers. And this helped the industry grow. Obviously, stunted growth during the Second World War, but then when you come back in the late 40s, early 50s, that's when the real development of the aviation industry took place. And like I just said, passengers were very affluent, they accepted the risks, and they just went anyway. So I think I need to give you a bit more detail on the Warsaw Convention. Basically, the key provision of the Warsaw Convention, which is now embodied in the Montreal Convention, if anyone's interested, is Article 17. Article 17 basically says this: the carrier is liable for damage sustained in the case of death or bodily injury of a passenger upon condition only that the accident, keyword, or the accident which caused the death or injury took place on board the aircraft or in the course of any of the operations of embarking or disembarking. So since this convention's come into effect in 1929, almost 90 years ago, we've got a whole mass of jurisprudence which basically says what an accident is in legal terms, what bodily injury is. It's not purely psychological injury. There has to be a physical element, and it has to happen on board the aircraft or whilst you're getting on or off. Now, there's also lots of jurisdiction about what constitutes embarkation, what constitutes disembarkation, and so on and so forth. But in general, the same principles were embodied in 1999 into the Montreal Convention, because obviously with the unbreakable limits, inflation happens, people are worth more towards the end of the 20th century than they were at the beginning. So there had to be a reform, and that reform was done in the Montreal Convention in 1999. And basically it says, yes, we've got limits. We'll raise the limit for liability for passengers and baggage and cargo. But if it was, basically you can break those limits if it was the fault of the carrier. And it's strict liability up to those limits. So the passenger's family or whoever doesn't have to prove fault on the part of the carrier, the airline, before up until a certain limit. And that limit is 112,000 special drawing rights, a special currency, which is probably about 100,000 euros, which is cheap really for a human life, which is why people often take out additional insurance. But it also comes down to the jurisdiction as well. It gets very complicated very quickly. Obviously, if you're in the United States, claims get boosted. If you're in a small Asian country or a Latin American country, they look at the local compensation limits for personal injury or death, and it's basically done in that context. It comes down to local domestic implementation of personal injury law. So, did it work? Did Warsaw work? Well, I think it's fair to say that the aviation industry has been a success. Well, success for the airlines. They carried 6.7 billion passengers per annum per the last Airport Council International's report. It's been modernised by the Montreal Convention. Yes, passenger rights have crept in, and they cause a big headache for airlines and people like me who are trying to keep costs low and operate and continue to compete in heavily saturated markets, if you like. But in general, it's worked. It's clarified the law. It's they're international treaties. Every time you go and get on a flight from here and you fly internationally, I would say, especially intra-EU traffic, there's a 99% chance, well, probably 100% chance, your carriage is subject to the Montreal Convention. So that clarifies and unifies the law across the whole of the European Union. It's largely stood the test of time. Now, if we flip to the space law treaties, they either don't apply to suborbital commercial space tourism, or they don't expressly govern liability issues which may arise between private commercial space tourism operators and their customers. Now, the reason being is there's basically 5 of them. The 2 I'm going to talk about is the Outer Space Treaty for 1966, which was followed by the Liability Convention in the 70s. And the reason why they don't apply to private space operators per se or directly is because obviously they're public international treaties, law treaties. So they govern the relationships of states amongst themselves. They don't govern the relationship between Virgin Galactic and Mr. Rich person who wants to get on board. Whereas the Warsaw Convention and the Montreal Convention are private international law treaties. They govern the commercial relationship between the passenger and the airline. That's a big distinction. So the Outer Space Treaty was signed in 1966. Article 6 sets out state responsibility for companies in its jurisdiction who want to go into space. Article 7 sets out liability in principle, but it doesn't really work. It it boils down to a system of licensing and launching. So you've got a lot of Dutch companies, which is why I think the Leiden University Institute is actually set up. There's a lot of Dutch space companies in and around Leiden and Delft and near Amsterdam. So you got a Dutch company. Now, in order to launch a satellite, in principle, that would be subject to the Outer Space Treaty and the Liability Convention as implemented into Dutch law by the Dutch government. So the Dutch government sets up a licensing scheme that licenses that company for whatever activities it wants to do. And once that's done, the Dutch government itself becomes liable for the actions or damage of Dutch company sending a satellite up into space. And that's a key thing to bear in mind, because if you think about these companies taking people up into space, how many governments are going to want to basically insure that operation? There aren't that many of them. Article 7, jurisdiction of space objects. Can't really remember what I was supposed to be telling you there, but I will check the convention. If anyone's interested, you can get the United Nations Handbook on the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs website, and you can download all the conventions. Article 8. Yeah, it's basically the state who suffers damage who has jurisdiction over the space object. The Liability Convention kind of takes the ideas of state responsibility and liability and develops them further. But it still doesn't go far enough. It's still regulating relationships between states and not states and private operators. Like I said, the launching state, in my example, the Netherlands, would basically be the first port of call if something went wrong and damage was caused by that Dutch satellite or that Dutch space object. So if it damaged something in France or hurt people in France, the French government, not the company or the people, would go and contact the Dutch government, and then, I better scoot through this because I've had my 5-minute warning. It wouldn't be a direct situation like you would have with an aviation issue. It's fault-based liability. There's a contributory negligence concept whereby if it's down to me that a space object landed and crashed in my jurisdiction, then there'd be a sharing of the liability. There's a claims process, but it's very long and drawn out. It's never been tested. And there's a limitation period for 1 year. That's important because the aviation limitation period is a 2-year period. I'm not going to talk about the registration convention. Now, when it gets interesting is when you look at how to apply them to the human spaceflight scenario. And like I said, you've got to keep in mind one's state law, one's international, public international law, one's private international law. So really, neither system works for commercial human spaceflight. I'm going to have to skip through this. The US are the only nation that have come close because of Virgin Galactic, because they've had to regulate. The FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, has been drafting laws and regulating in anticipation of Virgin Galactic operating. But as I said before, this is domestic law, it's not international law. It's going to get interesting from a legal perspective once Virgin Galactic can fly from California to Tokyo or something like that. But they're taking a very light touch and a hands-off approach to regulation, and they're basically saying to the passengers, we told you about the dangers of doing this, sign this piece of paper, then you will have no claim against us in the event of an accident, which, again, I don't think will stand up. The insurers are going to play a key role in this because nothing can take passengers up into space without an insurance portfolio. But I did saw a news report from the World Space Risk Forum last week in Dubai, which reported that only 50% of launchers are actually fully insured. Now that's a scary concept when you think about what goes up must come down. So, commercial issues. Right, do we need a new legal regime? What do you think? I think we do. Because I don't think either systems fit the scenario properly. We need a new private international legal regime to govern the liability of Virgin Galactic type enterprises vis-a-vis their passengers. It's likely not to become an issue until you've got like busloads of people nipping up to geo-stationary orbit and coming back down again. But you need to keep these concepts in mind, because if it's commercially viable, if in 10 years, yes, it becomes normal for people to take these trips, like a Ryanair is now, who knows? I think that's when it will get interesting, because we're going to have to have clear rules on who's liable for what and in what situations. I'm not on my own with that idea, but a lot of people have come up with short to medium term solutions. I know, okay, I've got to cut it. I'm going to let you all have a copy of my thesis if you really want to read it. It will be good for insomnia, you know, when you can't sleep at night. Insurance, yes, we talked about it. I'm sorry, I thought I had more time. I've got okay, private human spaceflight is coming to a spaceport near you. The US approach is very supportive. Insurers will be the key enablers. Commercial viability will play a significant role in whether it develops or not, unless there's a massive catastrophic loss, because I think that could shelve projects for a very long time. And just for fun, when astronauts fly at lower altitudes, they choose Emirates, my old employer. And that was just some tips for you all to get involved if you want to. If you want to know more about air law or space law, there's lots of different opportunities. The Royal Aeronautical Society has lots of interest groups all across the field of aerospace. The International Institute of Space Law is open to everybody. I'm on the board of the International Aviation Women's Association, and I know you've got women in aerospace here, yes? Yeah. But these are all good networking organisations to get involved if you want to. So get to know people, ask questions, do internships, identify mentors, because the sky is no longer the limit, okay? Sorry I had to rush through that.